So picture this slick animated cartoon video. It swept across the internet a few years ago.
Oh, right. I know exactly the one you mean.
Yeah, it racked up like millions of views in just a matter of days. And on one side of this split screen, you have Barack Obama's rise to power.
Right.
The animation shows, hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign financing, endless stadium rallies, and basically this massive national popularity contest.
Which culminates in a one-person, one-vote election.
Exactly. And that whole process is boldly labeled democracy. But then on the other side of the screen, the video tracks Xi Jinping's ascent.
It's a very different picture.
It's completely different. The animation shifts to this grueling, like decades-long climb. It shows promotions from a primary-level village office up to a township, then the county level.
Then provincial, the central committee.
Right, the Politburo, and finally the top spot. And at every single stage, the visual emphasizes these rigorous, ultra-competitive performance evaluations.
Tests that are designed to measure concrete leadership abilities.
Yeah, and that process is boldly labeled meritocracy.
And that visual contrast, I mean, it's really designed to be jarring for a Western viewer.
It totally is.
Because it forces a confrontation with this deeply ingrained, almost invisible assumption we hold about how power should actually be distributed.
It makes you ask a really uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
Like, what if we have been conditioned to believe that one person, one vote is the absolute only moral way to govern a country?
Right.
And, what if that assumption is completely blinding us to the practical benefits of a system explicitly, like, structurally designed?
We're looking at a highly provocative book. It's called The China Model: Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy.
Written by the political theorist Daniel A. Bell.
Yes, and our mission for this deep dive is to stick entirely outside of our political comfort zones.
Way outside.
We are going to impartially explore Bell's core thesis, which is that political meritocracy is a morally legitimate and practically effective alternative to electoral democracy.
And for you listening right now, I mean, the relevance of this is inescapable. China is the second largest economy in the world.
Its domestic policies basically dictate global markets.
International supply chains, environmental survival, global security, all of it. So whether you're prepping for a boardroom negotiation in Shanghai, or you're studying international relations, or, you're just trying to understand the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting beneath us.
You have to grasp how China actually governs itself. It's vital.
But before we dive into the mechanics of this system, we really need to set the ground rules for this conversation.
Yeah, we need to establish the analytical framework here.
Yeah.
Because this topic, it instantly triggers raw political emotions.
Oh, absolutely.
So to be crystal clear, we are not here to endorse an authoritarian regime.
Nope.
We are not here to take a side in a geopolitical rivalry or bash Western democracy.
Exactly. Our objective is purely to synthesize Bell's research. We want to look at the historical and empirical evidence he presents objectively and just try to understand a completely different paradigm of political philosophy on its own terms.
Right. And to understand why a culture might actively choose meritocracy, we actually have to start by shining a pretty harsh, uncomfortable light on our own default assumptions about democracy.
Which Bell refers to as like desacralizing the concept of one person, one vote.
That's a great word for it.
Yeah.
Because in Western liberal democracies, the act of voting has taken on this almost religious, sacred status.
It's valued intrinsically.
Exactly. We treat that famous Winston Churchill quote, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. We treat that like a law of physics.
It's basically a conversation ender in the West.
It is. But Bell argues that electoral democracy contains these inherent structural flaws, and they aren't just bugs in the software.
They're fundamental features of the system.
Right. He categorizes these structural failures into 4 specific tyrannies.
So let's bypass the usual surface-level complaints about politics and actually dig into the mechanisms of these 4 tyrannies. Let's start with the first one, which is the tyranny of the majority.
Okay, yeah. So we operate on this Enlightenment ideal of the rational, highly engaged voter, right?
The ideal citizen who reads all the policies.
Right. But Bell points to robust social science, proving that voters are, by definition, rationally ignorant.
Rationally ignorant. Break that down for us.
Well, the math of a national election means your single vote has basically zero statistical probability of altering the outcome.
Right. Mathematically speaking, you're just a drop in the ocean.
Exactly. Therefore, investing hundreds of hours to deeply understand complex macroeconomic policy or epidemiological science or nuanced foreign relations, that's a terrible return on investment for your time.
Because your one educated vote won't change anything anyway.
Precisely. And the psychological mechanism at play here is crucial, because acquiring deep policy knowledge is incredibly costly in terms of time and cognitive load.
You're busy, you have a job, you have kids.
Yeah, so voters inevitably default to cognitive shortcuts and biases. Bell actually relies heavily on behavioral economics to make this point.
Haiku.
He cites the work of Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman on optimism bias and Brian Kaplan's extensive research on economic biases.
Oh, I've seen some of this. It's fascinating.
It is. Voters consistently display an anti-market bias, failing to understand how supply and demand actually work.
And they display an anti-foreign bias, too, right?
Yeah.
Assuming trade is this zero-sum game where another country's gain just has to be our loss.
Yes. But the dangerous mechanism here isn't just that voters have biases.
Right, everybody has biases.
The danger is that the electoral system structurally rewards politicians for weaponizing those biases.
Oh, I see. Because if a politician tries to explain a nuanced, mathematically sound policy that requires, say, a short-term sacrifice for a long-term gain, they lose.
They get crushed. But if they pander to the irrational biases of the majority, they win. Bell points to a really famous example of the U.S. government placing heavy tariffs on Chinese tires.
Right, this was to save roughly, 1,200 American manufacturing jobs?
Something like that, yeah. And on a debate stage, saving American jobs triggers a wildly successful emotional response.
It plays perfectly to that anti-foreign bias.
It feeds it perfectly. But the economic reality was that those tariffs cost American consumers over $1 billion in higher prices across the board.
Wow. Wait, so how does that math break down?
It worked out to roughly $900,000 extracted from the public for every single $40,000 a year job saved.
That is just catastrophic economic policy.
But it was brilliant democratic politics, because it successfully exploited the rational ignorance of the majority.
Okay, that makes total sense. And that leads directly into Bell's second flaw, which is the tyranny of the minority.
Right.
Now, we all know Policy 101, wealthy elites and special interests capture the legislative process.
Sure, lobbying.
But Bell's specific point here is that this capture is only possible because the majority is rationally ignorant.
Exactly. The mechanism of capture relies entirely on asymmetric information.
Because a specialized pharmaceutical lobbyist, for example, knows exactly how a 3,000-page bill affects their industry.
Well, the general public has absolutely no idea that provision even exists.
So the democratic system is uniquely porous to concentrated wealth exploiting dispersed ignorance.
That's a perfect way to put it. Now, while legislative capture is a well-documented phenomenon, Bell's third critique is where the paradigm truly shifts.
This one blew my mind a little.
He calls it the tyranny of the voting community. This focuses on the temporal and spatial boundaries of the democratic franchise.
Temporal meaning time and spatial meaning location.
Right. A politician in an electoral democracy is structurally incentivized to care exclusively about the people who hold the power to vote for them in the next election cycle.
Which systematically disenfranchises anyone outside that immediate temporal boundary, specifically future generations.
Consider the mechanism of a 2- or 4-year election cycle. How does a system governed by a 48-month incentive structure effectively manage a 100-year existential crisis like climate change?
They don't, or they struggle massively.
Because who casts a ballot for the citizens of 2050 when a politician decides to slash taxes today, artificially inflate the current economy, and just leave a staggering mountain of national debt for the unborn to pay off?
No one does. The future unborn citizens don't have a PAC. They don't have lobbyists.
Right. Democracy fundamentally struggles with long-term planning because the incentive structure is brutally short-term. To survive politically, the representative has to prioritize immediate gratification over generational stability.
And you mentioned spatial boundaries, too, so that applies to non-citizens, right?
Yes. A Western democracy might elect a leader whose agricultural subsidies completely devastate farmers in the developing world.
Or whose military interventions displace millions of people.
But those foreign populations have absolutely zero democratic recourse. The voting community acts as a tyrant over the non-voting community.
Man, that is bleak. Which brings us to the final structural flaw. the tyranny of competitive individualists.
Electoral democracy essentially mandates that politics operates as a tribal blood sport.
Yeah, I mean, you literally cannot win an election by simply stating that your policies are just, like, marginally better than the other guys.
No, the mechanism of campaigning requires you to systematically tear down your opponent. You have to question their motives and basically paint the alternative as an apocalyptic threat.
And this constant cycle of negative campaigning, it exacerbates social conflict. It divides the populace into these warring tribal camps.
And it makes actual governance and compromise practically impossible once the election is finally over.
So, synthesizing all of this, Bell's asking us to view these systems through a totally different philosophical lens. In the West, as we said, democracy is intrinsic.
Right, the process itself is the point.
But in East Asian political philosophy, governance is viewed instrumentally, meaning a system is only legitimate if it produces good outcomes for the society.
Exactly. If a political operating system consistently outputs a rationally ignorant electorate, legislative gridlock, insurmountable generational debt, and bitter societal division, the pragmatic Chinese philosophical tradition asks a very simple question. Why preserve the system?
No, it makes me think about how we structure risk and reward in other massive organizations.
Oh, so?
Well, think of Western electoral democracy as, like, a venture capital model.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. It's high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
You get massive volatility, frequent leadership changes, and occasional catastrophic failures. But the system allows for sudden, disruptive leaps forward.
Okay, I follow that.
Political meritocracy, by contrast, is designed like an index fund. The entire mechanism is built to minimize volatility. It emphasizes slow, highly vetted, steady, compounding growth over decades. You eliminate the catastrophic downside of electing a charismatic but incompetent populist, but you also sacrifice the rapid agility of a disruptive change election.
That is an incredibly apt way to view the structural design. But we should note, Bell isn't just relying on theoretical models here.
He brings in real-world examples.
Yes, he points to places like Singapore to demonstrate how meritocratic principles are actively used to patch the vulnerabilities of democracy.
Okay, so how does Singapore do it? Because they hold democratic elections.
They do, but they place rigid constraints on the system to ensure long-term stability. For instance, they instituted an elected presidency where the president holds a veto power, specifically to prevent the government from raiding the national financial reserves.
Wait, but if they elect the president, how is that meritocratic? Doesn't that just invite another populist to come in and promise everyone a massive payout from the national savings?
That is exactly the vulnerability the system engineers against. To even qualify to appear on the ballot for that presidency, a candidate must pass incredibly stringent objective hurdles.
Like what kind of hurdles?
They must have already served as a cabinet minister, a chief justice, or the CEO of a company with at least $500 million in shareholder equity.
Oh, wow. So you have to be massively vetted before you even run.
Yes. The mechanism explicitly prevents an inexperienced populist from simply charming the public and gaining access to the national treasury. It's a structural safeguard designed to protect future generations from the short-term impulses of the current voting community.
Okay, I understand using Singapore as a theoretical stepping stone, but I have to push back a little on applying that directly to China.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
Singapore is a tiny, highly managed city-state. We're talking fewer than 6 million people. It's essentially a massive corporation. You cannot honestly compare managing a single port city to the staggering complexity of governing 1.4 billion people across a vast, diverse continent.
You are entirely correct. And Bell completely acknowledges that the Singaporean model cannot simply scale up to Chinese proportions.
Okay, good.
To understand how China manages that immense complexity, we actually have to look away from modern corporate analogies and look deep into Chinese history.
Right, because this didn't just pop up overnight.
Exactly. The concept of political meritocracy in China is not some modern invention of the Communist Party. It is the foundational DNA of their political culture, and it predates modern Western democracy by over a millennium.
This is where the history becomes really vital. We have to go way back to the Warring States period, right? Roughly the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE.
Yes, when China was deeply fractured.
And these philosophical thinkers were desperately debating how to restore order and govern effectively. This era birthed the radical concept of elevating the worthy.
Because prior to this, power was entirely aristocratic. It was determined solely by bloodlines and military might.
So basically who your dad was and how big your army was.
Right. But these philosophers began arguing that power should actually be distributed based on merit. The debate then became, well, what constitutes merit?
And you had a couple of different camps there.
Yes, the legalists argued for strict adherence to codified laws and a very pragmatic, almost ruthless statesmanship.
And then you had Confucius.
Exactly. Confucius argued that morality and deep ethical virtue were the ultimate merit. A ruler had to be a moral exemplar to inspire the population.
And this philosophical debate, it didn't just stay in the realm of theory, right? It actually birthed one of the most astonishing bureaucratic mechanisms in human history.
The imperial examination system, known as the Keju.
Starting tentatively in the Sui and Tang dynasties and really becoming the dominant force of society during the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties, China essentially invented the standardized test.
The Keju was a mechanism of unprecedented social mobility for the pre-modern world.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. The monopoly of the military aristocracy was systematically dismantled. The imperial state recognized that to manage a massive agrarian empire and maintain stability, it needed an administrative mechanism that could recruit the absolute brightest intellectual talent from every corner of the realm, regardless of their aristocratic pedigree.
Let's actually walk through the mechanism of what this looked like for a candidate, say, during the Ming Dynasty. Because we're not talking about filling in bubbles on a Scantron.
No, definitely not.
A young man, even the son of a poor farmer, could theoretically dedicate his entire life to studying the Confucian classics.
He would face local exams first.
And if he passed those, he faced provincial exams. And the pressure was unimaginable. Candidates were locked into these tiny individual cells for days at a time to write their exams.
Some literally died in those cells from stress and exposure.
Wait, they died? That's insane.
Yeah, the physical and mental toll was extreme. But if he survived and passed the national exams in the capital, he could become a top administrative advisor to the emperor himself.
So it psychologically shaped the entire culture. Education and bureaucratic service became the ultimate societal ideals.
They did. But as a mechanism, the Keju was deeply flawed. And analyzing those flaws is really critical to understanding Bell's warnings about modern China.
What went wrong?
Well, over centuries, the exam system ossified. It became obsessed with rigid formalism.
Oh, this leads to the infamous eight-legged essay, right?
Exactly. To pass the later imperial exams, a candidate had to write essays conforming to an incredibly strict, highly artificial 8-part structure.
Focusing entirely on classical interpretation.
Yes. Consider the mechanism of that incentive structure. It bred intense careerism and rote memorization.
It actively filtered out independent, creative thinkers, like people who could actually solve practical administrative problems like famine relief or river flooding. They were pushed aside in favor of scholars who can just perfectly mimic a 2,000-year-old writing style.
It's the ultimate warning about metrics becoming the target. When the metric for intelligence becomes a highly artificial essay, people optimize for the essay, not for governance.
And this rigid system eventually collapsed under the weight of Western imperialism and internal rebellion in the early 20th century.
And following that collapse, Mao Zedong's communist revolution attempted to actively destroy the meritocratic ideal altogether.
Because Maoism was fundamentally anti-intellectual.
Very much so. The mechanism of Maoist governance explicitly favored the ideological purity of peasants, workers, and revolutionary soldiers over the specialized knowledge of educated bureaucrats.
The Cultural Revolution was essentially a violent purge of expertise.
It was. But the pendulum violently swung back after Mao's death. When Deng Xiaoping took power and initiated the reform era in the late 1970s, he faced a country in absolute economic ruins.
Right, because Deng realized that revolutionary zeal does not build bridges. It doesn't manage supply chains or lift 1 billion people out of abject poverty.
To modernize, China needed an infusion of world-class specialized expertise. So Deng effectively engineered a massive revival of the meritocratic ideal.
He rebuilt the educational infrastructure and reinstated highly competitive examinations for public service.
The Communist Party basically transformed from a revolutionary vanguard into a highly technocratic bureaucracy.
So how does that historical legacy translate into the operational reality of today? Like, if the Keju is the ancient version, what is the specific mechanism of the China model in the 21st century?
Bell defines the modern operational structure as a vertical democratic meritocracy.
A vertical democratic meritocracy.
Yes. It is a highly deliberate, 3-tiered architectural design. And it fundamentally challenges the Western presumption that a single mechanism voting is the optimal tool for every single level of political organization, from a local school board all the way to the presidency.
Okay, let's deconstruct the three planks of this vertical architecture. Plank number one is democracy at the bottom.
Which might surprise a lot of Western listeners.
It surprised me. Since the late 1980s, China has actually utilized direct democratic elections at the village level.
Yeah.
But why? If they believe in meritocracy, why allow voting at all?
It comes down to the mechanism of epistemic proximity.
Meaning, how close the voter is to the knowledge required to make a good decision.
Exactly. At the village level, the issues are immediate, tangible, and simple. Do we pave the East Road or the West Road? Do we allocate funds for a new health clinic or a new irrigation ditch?
The voters have direct personal knowledge of those problems.
Furthermore, in a village setting, the voters personally know the candidates.
Right. They know who is honest, who's competent, and who is, the village crook.
Exactly. In this highly localized context, democracy functions exactly as intended because the voters are not rationally ignorant, they are intimately informed.
But Bill argues that as you move up the political hierarchy, the complexity of the issue scales exponentially.
Massively. A village voter might understand local irrigation, but they do not have the specialized knowledge to evaluate national monetary policy, or complex international trade tariffs, or the engineering specifics of transitioning a national grid to renewable energy.
And if you use democratic voting for those complex issues, you invite the Four Tyrannies back in. So how does the China model bridge the gap between the village and the central government?
That is the second plank, experimentation in the middle. Bell refers to this as experimentation under hierarchy.
How does that work in practice?
The central government in Beijing rarely hands down massive, untested, monolithic mandates. Instead, the middle layers of the hierarchy, the cities and provinces, act as massive policy laboratories.
Yeah.
The central government sets a broad national goal, and local leaders are actively encouraged to invent and test radical new economic or social policies to achieve it.
It's basically the mechanism of scaling, like running a beta test in tech.
That's a great analogy. If a mayor implements a novel healthcare policy in a mid-sized city and it completely fails, the damage is contained. The central government analyzes the failure, and that official is usually demoted.
But if it succeeds wildly,
Then the central organization department studies the data, refines the policy, and then scales it up to a provincial and eventually a national level.
and crucially, the official who designed the successful experiment is promoted.
Yes. And Bell points to a fascinating shift currently happening in this experimental middle layer. For decades, the singular metric for evaluating local leaders was how much they grew their local GDP,
Which created massive economic growth, obviously.
but also catastrophic environmental degradation. So recently, the central government allowed over 70 Chinese cities and counties to drop GDP as the primary metric for their leaders.
Wow, so what do they use instead?
They are experimenting with evaluating cadres based on environmental protection, air quality improvements, and poverty reduction metrics, just to see if changing the incentive structure produces more sustainable governance.
That is wild. Which brings us to the apex of the system, the third,
Ball clank.
meritocracy at the top. This is the 21st century equivalent of surviving the Ming Dynasty exam cells.
It really is. Aspiring officials do not simply raise a bunch of money and run for national office.
They can't just give a great speech.
No, they must enter a grueling, decades-long gauntlet of performance evaluations. The mathematical reality of this ascent is staggering.
Give us the numbers.
There are roughly 7 million government cadres in the Chinese bureaucratic system. Out of those 7 million, only about 1 in 140,000 will ever make it to the province or ministry level.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. 1 in 140,000. You basically have a better chance of being struck by lightning while cashing a winning lottery ticket. The sheer statistical filter is mind-boggling.
And to reach the ultimate peak of power, the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the top 7 leaders who effectively run the entire country, a candidate has to survive this continuous vetting process for 30 or 40 years.
30 or 40 years of constant evaluation.
Yes. By the time a leader reaches the Standing Committee, they have typically served as the governor or party secretary of 2 major Chinese provinces.
Which, scale-wise, is equivalent to managing a mid-sized European country.
Easily. You are managing populations of 50 to 80 million people, overseeing GDPs larger than many Western nations.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I was thinking about it like baseball.
Oh, how so?
So, Village elections are the minor leagues. You get scouted, you move to the majors in the provinces where you experiment with your swing, and only the absolute best, most consistently performing players over a 20-year career ever get to the World Series.
Which is the Politburo.
Exactly. The foundational argument of the China model is that you do not want someone learning how to govern on the job at the national level.
You don't. You do not want a charismatic real estate developer or a popular actor or a junior senator suddenly handed the nuclear codes and control of a $15 trillion economy.
The system is just a massive structural filter designed to guarantee that anyone who reaches the top has decades of proven empirical executive experience.
But if we accept the premise that this is a hyper-competitive filter, the obvious question becomes, what exactly is the filter looking for?
Right. If the system claims to be a meritocracy, how is merit actually defined and measured in a modern bureaucracy?
Well, Bell identifies 3 specific pillars of political merit that the system attempts to measure: intellectual ability, social skills, and virtue.
Let's unpack the mechanisms of measuring each one of those. First, intellectual ability. And to be clear, we aren't talking about writing 8-legged essays anymore.
No. Modern entry into the civil service requires passing incredibly rigorous public service exams. These tests are structurally similar to advanced cognitive and analytical reasoning assessments combined with deep policy knowledge.
So they're testing how you actually think.
Yes. They present complex data sets and require the candidate to synthesize the information, identify the core structural problems, and propose mathematically and practically sound policy solutions.
The mechanism is designed to establish a very high baseline of analytical rigor. It basically explicitly filters out anyone who lacks the sheer cognitive horsepower to understand complex systems.
But raw IQ isn't enough to govern.
Never is.
That's where the second pillar, social skills, comes in. And to be clear, Bell isn't talking about being charming at a fundraiser or giving a rousing speech.
Right, he defines political social skills as the ability to navigate a labyrinthine bureaucracy, the emotional intelligence to build consensus among rival factions, and the capacity to maintain social harmony within massive teams.
Interestingly, Bell actually critiques the current Chinese system heavily on this exact point.
Oh, why?
He argues that because the system deeply values these collaborative, consensus-building social skills, it structurally ought to be promoting a vastly higher number of women into top leadership roles.
Because the data consistently shows that female leaders often excel in those exact areas of organizational management.
Yes. Yet the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party remain overwhelmingly male. So Bell argues this is a failure of the system to live up to its own meritocratic ideals.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And then we reach the third, and easily the most controversial pillar of merit, virtue.
Yes. In the Confucian tradition, a leader must possess the genuine desire to serve the public good, rather than enriching themselves or their family.
But how do you empirically measure the virtue of a politician's soul? I mean, that seems impossible.
It is difficult. For decades, the proxy metric for virtue was economic growth. If you grew the economy and raised the living standards of your province, you were deemed virtuous.
And the empirical result of that specific incentive structure is undeniable. I mean, it led to the single greatest alleviation of poverty in human history.
Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of destitution in a single generation. Bell points out a really stark comparison here. China has completely eradicated famine.
Wow.
Its record on preventing infant malnutrition and providing baseline public health is vastly superior to electoral democracies of similar geographic and demographic scale, specifically India.
Because the meritocratic mechanism allowed leaders to make massive, coordinated investments in public infrastructure and poverty alleviation without worrying about losing the next election to a rival party that was just promising tax cuts.
Exactly. But as China's economy matures and growth naturally slows down, GDP is no longer sufficient as a proxy for virtue.
So what takes its place?
This is where the mechanism of peer review becomes critical in the upper ranks of the system.
I found this mechanism really fascinating because in a corporate hierarchy, you're usually evaluated by your boss. In a democracy, you are evaluated by the voters. But Bell argues that at the highest levels of the China model, promotion is heavily dictated by peer evaluation.
Yes.
Why are peers better judges of virtue than the public?
Because of the mechanism of information asymmetry we discussed earlier, a politician can easily hire a PR firm to craft a flawless public image, right?
Yeah, they do it all the time.
They can give eloquent speeches and manipulate the rational ignorance of the voting public to appear incredibly virtuous. Furthermore, a cunning politician can always flatter and manipulate their immediate superior.
But you cannot fake competence and virtue to the colleagues you have worked in the trenches with for 20 years.
Exactly. Your peers know if you are a narcissistic credit stealer. They know if you are quietly taking bribes or if you actually understand the nuances of the policy. Peer review acts as a structural firewall against charismatic demagogues and sociopaths rising to the top.
Okay, let's stop here. We have spent a lot of time outlining the theoretical ideals and the structural logic of this system. It sounds very impressive on paper,
It does.
but we have to pivot. Is this a flawless, technocratic utopia? Absolutely not. If we are being impartial, we have to tear into the severe, potentially fatal flaws that Bell identifies. The criticisms of the China model are massive.
And Bell does not shy away from them at all.
Yeah.
He identifies the most significant existential threat to the entire system. He calls it the stake in the heart of the China model.
Which is corruption.
Yes. Let's compare the mechanism of corruption in both systems. In a Western democracy, if a president or prime minister is caught taking a massive bribe, it's a huge scandal.
People are outraged.
Right. But the system itself doesn't collapse. The democratic system derives its fundamental legitimacy from the process of voting itself. You simply wait for the next election cycle and you vote the corrupt leader out.
The system functions as designed.
But in a political meritocracy, the mechanism of legitimacy is entirely different. The government does not have the mandate of the ballot box.
It claims the fundamental right to rule because it claims its leaders possess superior competence and virtue.
Therefore, if the public discovers that the meritocratically selected leaders are actually hoarding millions of dollars in bribes, funneling state assets to their relatives, and living as corrupt oligarchs,
The entire regime loses its philosophical justification to exist. Corruption isn't just a crime in a meritocracy. It is a structural mechanism that destroys the mandate of heaven. It unravels the core logic of the system.
Exactly. Another critical vulnerability Bell highlights is the danger of ossification.
We saw this historical mechanism with the eight-legged essay.
We did. Even without a rigid exam format, mapped bureaucratic hierarchies naturally become conservative and risk-averse.
The mechanism of bureaucratic survival kicks in. Like if you are a mid-level official and you realize that taking a bold, innovative risk might result in failure and end your career.
You don't take it.
Right. But if simply pleasing your superiors, flattering the party line, and maintaining the status quo guarantees a steady rise, you stop innovating. The system breeds sycophants instead of problem solvers.
And in a 21st century global economy that's defined by rapid technological disruption and complex international crises, an ossified, sycophantic bureaucracy is literally a death sentence for a nation.
Which leads directly into the crisis of accountability and legitimacy. The system has derived its legitimacy for 40 years by delivering mind-boggling double-digit economic growth.
But trees don't grow to the sky.
The Chinese economy is naturally slowing down. It is transitioning to a consumer economy. It faces massive demographic crises with an aging population.
When the economic miracle fades, how does an unelected government maintain the ongoing consent of the governed?
That is the most urgent question Bell poses. Without the release valve of democratic elections, a meritocratic government facing an economic downturn must find alternative mechanisms to prove its legitimacy or risk widespread social unrest.
And this is where I have to push back hard on behalf of the Western perspective. How does the Chinese state currently handle that threat of unrest?
Through severe systemic information control and human rights abuses.
Yes.
When the economy wobbles, or when citizens demand accountability, the state mechanism doesn't just listen patiently. It often cracks down. There's massive censorship of the internet, suppression of independent journalism, and the arrest of political dissidents.
Which critics point out constantly.
Right, because if you cannot freely criticize the government, if you cannot organize an independent opposition party, and if you have absolutely no mechanism to peacefully vote the top leaders out of power, aren't you just living in a high-tech dictatorship, regardless of how meritocratic the leadership claims to be?
That is the ultimate tension of the model, and it is the primary reason the West rejects it outright. Bell acknowledges this severe reality.
How does he address it?
He points specifically to President Xi Jinping's massive ongoing anti-corruption campaign. On one hand, Bell argues the campaign was absolutely necessary to cleanse the system of the very corruption that threatened to destroy the meritocracy's legitimacy.
Okay, so a necessary purge.
But the mechanism used to execute that campaign, relying on internal party discipline rather than transparent independent courts, has instilled deep paralyzing fear throughout the bureaucracy.
It's led to a noticeable tightening of civil liberties, increased surveillance, and a chilling effect on the very policy experimentation the system relies on.
So, how does Bell reconcile this? Does he just accept authoritarian suppression as the cost of doing business?
I hope not.
No, he doesn't. He outlines a series of necessary structural solutions if China is to sustain this model into the future without devolving into simple tyranny.
What's the first solution?
First, he argues China must establish a much stronger independent rule of law to check the arbitrary power of the central party. The law must apply equally to the highest officials.
Makes sense. Second,
They must create truly independent supervisory bodies to root out corruption transparently, rather than relying on opaque internal party purges.
he also leans back into the history, suggesting they need to deeply integrate Confucian ethics into the education of officials to organically instill a sense of public duty rather than relying on fear of punishment.
But the most surprising solution he offers actually involves free speech.
Really? Free speech in China?
Yes. Bell argues that a successful meritocracy actually requires a high degree of freedom of speech, not necessarily to foster the creation of rival political parties, but because free speech is a vital epistemic mechanism.
It's an information gathering tool.
Precisely. Without a free press and open public discourse, the central government is essentially flying blind.
Because they rely on reports from lower-level officials who have a massive vested interest in hiding their failures.
Exactly. Free speech allows the central government to identify localized corruption they would otherwise miss. It allows them to gauge genuine public sentiment.
And crucially, to identify new, unconventional sources of talent that might not naturally rise through the rigid bureaucratic exams.
Bell even goes so far as to suggest that eventually, to permanently solve the looming legitimacy crisis, the Chinese government might need to implement a mechanism of direct democracy at the national level.
Wait, like a presidential election?
No, not an election to choose a new president, but a national referendum. A binding vote where the public is asked to explicitly secure their consent for the continuation of the meritocratic system itself.
Wow, it'd be a monumental gamble, asking the public to democratically validate the restriction of their own democratic rights in exchange for competent governance.
It would be fascinating to watch.
So, having explored the deep mechanics of both systems, let's put these two completely different paradigms side by side. Meritocracy versus Western democracy. Let's compare their operational realities.
Let's start with the mechanism of decision-making. Western democracies fundamentally rely on partisan competition.
You have eloquent speeches, highly publicized debates, and a legislative process that intentionally divides power.
Which often results in gridlock. Because opposing parters have a structural incentive to ensure the other side fails so they can win the next election.
The China model, on the other hand, relies on consensual, committee-based, expert-driven decision-making.
It is entirely opaque to the public, which is a major flaw. But once a consensus is reached behind closed doors, the execution is highly efficient and unified.
Compare the political incentives. In the West, consider how a politician spends their day. A massive percentage of their time is spent dialing for dollars, attending fundraisers, and strategizing for the next campaign.
They exist in a state of perpetual campaigning.
In the Chinese meritocracy, cadres spend their time attempting to hit highly specific, measurable performance metrics.
They're trying to orchestrate the construction of a high-speed rail network or lower carbon emissions in their province, specifically to impress the central organizational department evaluating their career.
Finally, look at the tension between expertise and populism. Democracies are structurally vulnerable to populist waves.
If the voting public suddenly embraces an anti-science bias regarding vaccines or an anti-market bias regarding trade, politicians are incentivized to pander to that irrationality to survive.
Meritocracies theoretically insulate decision-making from populism. They empower scientists, engineers, and economists to make data-driven choices.
But the mechanism of that insulation is also its greatest danger.
How so?
When you insulate leaders from the public, those unelected experts run the severe risk of becoming detached, arrogant, elitist, and utterly unresponsive to the localized, on-the-ground suffering caused by their grand macroeconomic plans.
That is the constant balancing act the system has to manage.
It is.
So if this system is responsible for orchestrating China's massive, unprecedented economic miracle, should other developing nations try to copy it? Should we be actively exporting the China model to countries struggling with poverty and instability?
Bell's answer to that is a definitive and resounding no.
Really? Why not?
Because the China model is not a franchisable product. It is incredibly context-specific.
Why can't a developing nation in Latin America or Africa simply adopt the three planks, the local democracy, the provincial experiments, the national meritocracy?
Because the mechanics of the system rely on specific underlying conditions. First, it relies on centuries of deeply ingrained Confucian culture that organically respects educational hierarchy and bureaucratic authority.
Okay, that's deeply cultural.
Second, it relies on the massive geographic and demographic scale of China, which necessitates a sprawling, multi-layered bureaucracy to function at all.
And third?
And third, it relies on the unique, often brutal historical evolution of the Chinese Communist Party to enforce the structure. Aside from perhaps Vietnam, which shares some of that specific cultural and historical DNA, almost no other country has the pre-existing conditions required to successfully implement a vertical democratic meritocracy.
The soil has to be right for the seed to grow.
Precisely. However, Bell suggests that while we shouldn't copy the system wholesale, Western democracies could selectively adopt specific mechanisms to patch our own structural blind spots.
Oh, that's interesting. Like,
He explores several provocative ideas. One is requiring basic competency exams for voters testing whether a voter actually understands the policy they are voting on.
which, politically and historically in the United States, is an absolute non-starter. I mean, given the history of using literacy tests for racist voter suppression, the concept is entirely toxic in a Western context.
Bell completely acknowledges that reality, but he offers other mechanisms. What about structurally giving more binding weight to expert, nonpartisan agencies when designing long-term economic or scientific policy?
Or perhaps his most fascinating proposal, creating a specific legislative house, a new branch of government, whose sole constitutional mandate is to represent the interests of future generations and non-citizens.
Yes. This body would act as a structural check against the short-term, rationally ignorant impulses of democratically elected politicians.
The overarching point isn't to abandon democracy and just blindly copy China. The point is to develop the intellectual humility to recognize that our own system has massive structural vulnerabilities, and we can look to different political paradigms for inspiration on how to engineer better outcomes.
We have covered a massive amount of philosophical, historical, and structural ground today.
We really have. Let's synthesize this entire deep dive. We have distilled Daniel Bell's complex arguments into 5 key takeaways worth remembering for our listeners.
Number 1, we must confront the reality that electoral democracy possesses inherent structural flaws.
Specifically, the mechanism of short-term elections systematically incentivizes politicians to ignore long-term planning and entirely neglect the needs of non-voters, like future generations.
Number 2, political meritocracy is not a modern authoritarian invention designed by the Communist Party.
Right. It is a deeply rooted cultural ideal with a 1,300-year history, originating with the rigorous mechanisms of the Keju imperial examination system.
Number 3, the operational reality of the China model functions on a specific vertical axis.
It utilizes the epistemic proximity of democracy at the local level, harnesses policy experimentation at the provincial level, and enforces a strict, decades-long meritocratic filter at the national level to manage immense complexity.
Number 4, the ultimate existential threats to political meritocracy are corruption and rigid, risk-averse ossification.
Because the system's entire claim to legitimacy rests on the virtue and competence of its leaders, corruption acts as a mechanism that destroys its fundamental right to exist.
And number 5, while the China model relies on specific cultural and historical conditions and is not a wholesale exportable product, deeply understanding its mechanics forces us to step outside our default Western assumptions.
It forces us to evaluate global politics through a much more objective, pragmatic lens. As we wrap up this exploration, we want to organically fold in a few key concepts we've analyzed today, kind of a glossary for you to take away.
Right. We explored the mechanism of political meritocracy, which is the radical idea of distributing power based on rigorously tested ability rather than wealth, pedigree, or popular vote.
We traced the history of the Keju, the ancient exam system that birthed the world's first standardized testing bureaucracy.
We mapped the architecture of the vertical democratic meritocracy, Bell's framework for how local democracy and national meritocracy coexist.
We dissected the four tyrannies, how the majority, the minority, the voting community, and competitive individualists structurally distort democratic outcomes.
And we analyzed the scaling mechanism of experimentation under hierarchy, using cities as laboratories for national policy.
And before we go, we want to leave you, the listener, with a few discussion questions to mull over on your own.
First, Does the Chinese system of decades-long performance evaluations actually produce better leaders than democratic elections?
Second, how can a meritocracy legitimately measure virtue?
Third, is it ethical to deny citizens the right to vote for their national leader if it actually results in better economic outcomes for the poorest citizens?
Fourth, do the four tyrannies of democracy ring true in your own experience of Western politics?
And finally, could any elements of the China model be successfully adapted in your own country without sacrificing human rights?
To close, consider the overarching trajectory of the 21st century. We are facing crises of unprecedented scale and complexity.
Global climate change, rapid resource depletion, the integration of artificial intelligence, and massive global economic transitions.
It's the ultimate stress test for our political operating systems.
Indeed. If, over the next 100 years, political meritocracies prove structurally capable of executing the long-term, decades-long planning required to survive these existential crises, while electoral democracies remain paralyzed by short-term partisan gridlock and populist swings.
Will future generations look back at our absolute, unquestioning obsession with one person, one vote, not as a sacred moral absolute, but as a bizarre, highly inefficient historical quirk?
It is a profound mechanism to ponder as we watch the global order evolve.
Thank you for joining us on this rigorous intellectual journey into the mechanics of power. We'll see you next time.